Good afternoon. For those of you joining us in other time zones, good morning and good evening. This is Jennifer Averill from Data Conversion Laboratory. We are very happy to have you join us today for our webinar, part of our DCL Learning Series webinars. Today's webinar is Keys to Successfully Automating Your Content Lifecycle, Approaching the Problem, which is first in what will be a three-part series. We are very happy to have with us today Barry Schaeffer of Content Lifecycle Consulting. Before we get started, I just want to tell everyone a little bit about the webinar today as well as about DCL, and then I will introduce Barry. First of all, if you have a question over the course of the webinar, please feel free to type that into the questions bar on your screen. I will be taking and managing those questions, and we will have a formal Q&A at the end of the webinar in about the last 10 minutes or so. The webinar is being recorded and will be available for playback. That will be sent out automatically by our webinar platform, as well as available on the DCL website, which is dclab.com. In addition, if you have any issues with audio or video over the course of the webinar, you can also let me know that in the question and answer bar, and I will try to fix the problem as quickly as possible. I'm going to tell you briefly a little bit about Data Conversion Laboratory and the work we do. Just pulling up my own internal screen here. Data Conversion Laboratory is located in Queens, New York. We have 30 years of experience providing electronic document conversion services, meeting the needs of technology today and in the future. The company has converted over 1 billion pages to date. We transform both legacy and future documents with a U.S.-based project management team that has global capabilities. We employ our proven automated process across an array of services for a client base that spans the gamut, everything you can imagine, from publishing to institutions to industry. And today we are welcoming our guest speaker, Barry Schaeffer. We are really pleased to have Barry today. Barry is the principal consultant of Content Lifestyle Consulting. He's a veteran of more than 45 years in the information field and has a lot of great ideas to share with us and information to share with us today. He has founded and led 2 successful firms and consulted with organizations in both public and private sectors. I'm very, very happy to introduce Barry Schaeffer.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all for attending. I'd say thank you all for coming, but I guess you're where you are and we're where we are. At any rate, what we want to talk about today, and I hope that I can leave you with some information that will be helpful. One of the things I think we can all say is that if we're not in the middle of upgrading or moving into automation with content of some kind, we're probably phasing that in the very near future. So the question is, how do you do it, and how do you do it successfully? Well, approaching the problem as one of the things I think we need to deal with, and that's if you're contemplating a major automation project, the odds are kind of against you. This doesn't get talked about a lot. Of course, vendors don't talk about places where they sell that don't work very well, and people who get involved in projects that don't work as well as they would like typically don't talk about them either, except in very rarefied terms. So, so it's sometimes hard to see, but the odds really are against you. And in terms of what we can see, technology-centric projects usually end up costing too much, taking too long, underperforming. In other words, working, but not really working at a level that you might consider fully successful. And we see an awful lot of this. There are very few complete failures in the industry, and that's been true for some time. But there are an awful lot of jury rigs working where it certainly should be working better and costing less and putting less load on the people who have to make it work than there are. In many cases, and I've seen this over the years a number of times, projects that don't do necessarily quite what they should have also pretty major negative effects on the organizations that attempt them. Technology and operating groups sometimes tend to be at each other's throats. The budgetary people end up getting very upset because what they were told things were going to cost, it turns out to be significantly less than reality. The main thing is, there is a trail of problems that can get left behind. Technology is raced ahead. I'm loath to admit that I was in the business far enough back that that technology really was in its kind of infancy. First mainframe computer I worked on in the mid-'60s had all of 3/4 of a megahertz, and I can't even imagine what it would have been like then if we had the power that we do now. But our ability to deploy technology is not a lot better than it was decades ago. In fact, in some cases, we've even lost some abilities. I think partly because, and this has been true certainly in my experience over the years, but I think it has been true that as technology gets better, we tend to think a little bit less carefully about what we're doing. Tendency, and I used to hear this, we'll just throw more technology at it. Well, we've gotten to a point where that's fairly difficult to do and make work, even though there's lots of technology to throw. Well, so why is that? Why is all this true, and what can we do to do about it? Well, most projects find themselves focusing on technology almost from the start. That's not always intended, but oftentimes it happens. It's true, technology is more fun than procedures and talking with people and getting operational groups involved. That can be very messy. The key determiners of your success on most projects, obviously there are some projects that don't fall into this category, but I think not all that many, are your organization, staff, and current procedures. How are you doing things now? When you think about it, it's the staff especially is probably your most expensive resource. You probably spend as much each year on staff as you would spend on one time on a major technological project. So getting the staff to be efficient is a tremendous determiner of how things are working in your organization. All of these things are the foundation on which your tomorrow will be built. I think it's often said that you can't really just drop technology onto something that isn't working well and expect that it will work better unless you make it work better. The way things are happening now, your procedures, your staff, how you handle your content now, even will spell success or failure for the technology that you ultimately choose. Well, you need to get people involved. And if you don't know who they are and what they do and include them early, you're probably not going to be fully successful. Not to say that the technology won't work. I can remember a time when just getting the technology to perform was difficult enough that tended to be the focus of pretty much everything, because if you couldn't make it work, then you weren't going anywhere. If things don't work better, faster, and more transparently, and I mean across your entire organization or that part that is being impacted by a project that you might be considering, when you're finished, all the technology in the world is still going to spell failure. And we've certainly seen there are some horror stories that I'm sure that you may have read of over the years where organizations spend tens, maybe in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars and just don't end up with anything that works any better. Well, you can't win. You can't really make all this work properly if you don't know your team. And in many cases, the people who are charged with putting together an automation-based project really don't know a lot about, quote, the team. Best way to get the impacted organizations involved? Well, my sense, and I've been involved in doing this since the early 90s, is to create what are called cross-functional teams. A good working maximum is 10 people, and there should be a team covering each area of the operation that's going to be impacted. Cross-functional teams is not my idea. It actually comes from an approach called concurrent engineering that was developed in the early 80s and adopted by the U.S. Department of Defense in, I think it was 85, as a way of getting everything on the table at the same time. All of the people who were going to be involved, both technological and operational. It's a challenge, but it has worked very well, and I've seen it, been involved in many projects where it's used. Preferably,
Barry?
I'm sorry.
Hi, Barry. This is Jennifer. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we have a few people reporting that they're not seeing the screen moving. So I just wanted to make sure. I know that you do have control of the screen. I can see that from here.
Okay.
You are the presenter. Everything should be working.
What shall we do?
I'm not sure. We could try reloading the screen, which we can, if you want to just handle a reload on your end. It might just be I'm not sure what the issue would be that would make it frozen
Okay.
for.
Well, are they stuck on the first screen? It never
They're
moves?
stuck on the first screen.
Oh, my God.
I'm just having some reports of that. I'm so sorry to
Okay.
interrupt.
Let me see. So if I go back and click show my screen again,
We could
would
try
that be
that.
it?
Mm-hmm. Yay, I see it. If people could report into me and let me know if they are now seeing the screen.
Okay, we'll
Those of
wait
you who are having problems, it's fine on my end now, and these are the things we have to deal with technology. That's why we need people like Barry. Thank you so much.
I hope this makes my point.
I'm
Forgive
I'm
us, those of you who are wondering what the heck is happening.
I'm
Okay, should
bowing
I go
back
back
out.
to the beginning? I assume I shouldn't go back to the beginning.
No, if you could do maybe a brief overview, let's just make sure everything is working smoothly, and then we can go forward and pick up where you are now.
To do that, what we'll do is we'll go back.
There we go. Okay, but just go back into the full screen. Wonderful. Yay.
All right. So
Thank you for bearing with us, everyone.
Oh, yeah, folks. I'm really sorry about that. We did that purposely just to illustrate. We're going to be talking about, obviously, automating your content lifecycle. When we think about it, content is very important. There are lots of things that happen in an organization, but for the most part, unless they happen in a way that affects or creates or deals with some content, they tend not to be kind of part of that lifecycle. So if you're contemplating a major automation project, the odds are against you. And we're going to talk about why that is. Most projects, many projects, cost too much, take too long, underperform, create some major negative effects on the organizations that attempt them. And although we've raced ahead in technology, I think when you think about it, the people who started technology in the computer field back in the, you might say, 50s would just be amazed at what they see. But we're not a lot better at deploying it than we were decades ago. Well, why is this true? What can be done about it? We're going to talk about that. Most projects find themselves focusing on technology. Key determiners really are the organization, the staff, the current procedure. Usually looked upon as kind of raw material for the content, for the technology. But in the end, they're the foundation on which your tomorrow is going to be built, whether you like it or not. They even spell success or failure for technology that you choose. Well, if you don't know who these people are, you can't get them involved, and you can't include them early in the effort. So you probably won't be successful if you do that. And if things don't end up working better, then it doesn't matter what technology you put in, it's going to spell failure. Well, got to know your team. Best way to do that, I believe, is, and I think we're getting back to where we stopped, cross-functional teams. Coming out of concurrent engineering from the Department of Defense and from manufacturing, where it began in the 1980s. Very powerful concept. Have a team of maybe 10 maximum, although less is probably the best. Have at least one knowledgeable representative from each affected area in that team. It might be content creation, it might be preparation for delivery, it might be management. It might be cataloging, for instance, if you're talking about finding aids. Support each team with some level systems technical mentor. Could be a consultant or someone from your staff. I dealt with a major manufacturing company a few years ago who actually had people on their staff called systems analysts. And they were not technical people. They were basically, how do we put a project together and organize it? And most of the ones that I met were really very capable. Once you get that team together, and one of the things I think it makes sense to point out here is that there are a couple of side benefits from setting those teams up, assuming that you mean what you're doing. One of them, and an awful lot of organizations forget this and end up dealing with it later, is that an operational group feels good about what you're doing if it feels it's a part of your project. That doesn't happen very often. The typical is that the technical people, might spend a couple hours with a couple of operating managers, and then they go off and design the system and bring the operating people to tell them what they've done. And I've seen this in some very large organizations, and I've seen it happen very painfully. That is, an organization, the operational people, if they feel that they're not part of it, then they take no ownership in it, and they can push back hard. The technological people kind of tend to have, and I think this is a myth, the feeling that they really are the folks who have the power. But, you know, in many cases, their budget is smaller, their power is smaller, and their management isn't as high as the people in the operating group. So getting those folks involved early, getting them to take ownership is going to pay tremendous dividends down the pipe. You charge them with reviewing and documenting their part of the current procedure. It's amazing what you find when you do this and do it really seriously. It can often mean some very painstaking and painful investigation. It means that you end up opening up some Pandora's boxes of things that you might have been living with, things that even don't work very well at all, and the staff is just working overtime, working really hard to keep things running. And all of a sudden, you have to put those on the board. You can spend hours at the blackboard charting how well and how things work today, because you have to know that if you're going to make changes. Here are some good rules of thumb to do that. Follow the content. A little bit like follow the money in financial investigations. There are lots of things that go on in your organization that are important, no question about it, but that do not focus, use or focus or impact the content that's flowing through the organization. And so if you focus on those procedures, those organizations, those job descriptions that have a real impact on the content, are absolutely dependent on the content for doing their jobs correctly, you'll be able to not ignore the other, but to put the content-related things up front. That can be a very good way of shortening the process so that you can move on down the line. No one likes to have things take a long, long time. What we're talking about here is probably going to take longer than you might expect, but it probably won't take longer to get a successful implementation than it would have anyway. One of the things you need to do is identify the workaround. Every process. Dealt with the state government a few years back who had, in fact, they said, we have Band-Aids on our procedures so thick you can hardly see through them, because every time we did something, we put a Band-Aid on top of it. Then we put a Band-Aid on top of something else. And we've got technology that doesn't work together. We've got all kinds of crazy things that we had to do because we never stopped and took a look at what we were doing and replanned and rethought it. So you need to identify those. You need to get them up so you can see what they are, because what happens is you put a Band-Aid on it, and the Band-Aid is usually skin colored so that you might not see it. It's there, but it kind of gets glossed over a little bit. It doesn't show up on the PowerPoint presentations. It looks like everything's running pretty well. The analysis that you come up with, and you should put everything on paper, is your roadmap to progress. Without it, you're not probably going to have much of a chance of really fixing or improving. Because unless you know what's happening, it's very difficult to say what you want to happen in the future. It's very difficult to think about how technology can make that happen. Well, don't merely add automation to a marginal situation. I think this is a good rule of thumb, because after automating a chaos, all I end up with is an automated chaos. And as I'm sure many of you have seen in your travels, you can take automated chaos and paper it over pretty well, so it looks pretty good. It makes a good PowerPoint presentation. But boy, if you get down in the guts of it, it's not doing a very good job. That's one of the things that you want to avoid. And the thing is, you don't want to have to do something and then go back and do it again. And that happens a lot. I've been involved in lots of projects where they say, well, we want to do this. And then you realize what they were really saying is, we want to redo something we did 2 years ago or 3 years ago, but we don't really want to call it that. What we want to say is, well, we want to move forward. And that's great. You should, and they should have. But they didn't want to admit that they had failed before, and they were living with the parts of that failure. So this is, I think, a very important thing to keep in mind. As you progress along this path, you're also likely to notice that many of the solution factors you come up with are going to involve functional and procedural remedies. There is a myth, I think, that, well, if we just get the right technology, everything will work fine. And without in any way denigrating technology, because we have some tremendous tools and concepts, it's probably true that there are some functional and procedural things that, unless you fix them, technology is probably not going to improve your life. What doesn't work today is going to impact your technology for tomorrow. And I've seen it over and over that people took a non-functional or a very marginally functional situation and just dropped technology on it because that's kind of the way they looked at things. Technology works, makes a great presentation, but things don't get better. You must know how your organization runs today in order to make it better. And it's true, I think. We're all human. No one really wants to say, boy, things aren't running all that great, especially when they might have had an unwitting hand in how things are running today. It's much easier to say, yeah, it's okay, we just want to make it better. Do this first. When the part of the project that we're talking about here comes to an end, and you go on to the technology side, you may not get a chance to do this because technology has its own imperative, and once you get to that point where you're talking to vendors, you're deciding whether it's open source or off the shelf, you're looking at demonstrations, you're probably not going to be able to go back and do much in the way of functional analysis. So get this done first. IT, in many places, IT and operations don't typically work very well together. In fact, in some cases, and I hate to admit that it's true because we're all in this industry together, they don't trust each other in many cases. Operations people think technology is just out to aggrandize themselves at the operating organization's expense. Some feel very strongly that way, and some of the technology people look at operations and view them as kind of an undisciplined mob, if you will, that doesn't take well to organization, doesn't take well to new things. And in some cases, unfortunately, that is true. This phase may take more time than you expect. It may generate some friction with the technical groups, and you have to be prepared for that. As we talked about earlier, if you have the operating people kind of on the team, feeling that they are really a part of the project, this is going to be much easier because it's amazing how flexible operational groups can be if they feel that what they have to bring to the table is value. And if you can set that up early, boy, oh boy, is it going to make things easier at this point. This whole thing's going to be a little messy, simply because technology is very organized. It's very logical. It's designed to be so. But organizations, even well-run organizations, are not so large. They're made up of people, procedures, and budgetary limitations. So this whole process will be a little messy. That's okay, as long as you keep moving toward a real understanding of what you're dealing with and a real understanding of what works and what doesn't, so you know what you need to fix. But it'll be worth the effort if you do it. I think I can guarantee you that. Well, okay, now you're at a point where you know and your teams know and you have documented what you're doing. And how are you going then to move forward? Well, have your teams describe software tools that you're going to need in functional terms. You don't have to say we need a database from vendor A or we need this software tool. You can say we need a tool here that will do the following thing. And at this point, especially if you've had your teams mentored by someone with a systems background, they're going to understand what they need to do functionally, and they can document that to say, we need a tool right here that will do these things, that will integrate with other tools in our environment in this way. And that becomes a model for what you actually end up buying. You can't decide on what you're going to buy unless you know what you should expect from it. One of the things in today's world, 30 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago, it was tough to buy technology products that would do all that you want because this technology was tough and compute power simply hadn't matured to the state that it is now. But today, our problem is we've got tools out there that do so many things that some of them are overkill. And you need to know what to expect. You need to get everything that you need, but you really probably don't want to get a whole bunch of stuff that you don't need, because you're going to have to pay for that anyway, and it's going to get in the way when you try to do customizations and things like that. So you need to know what you expect. You need to know what changes in your operation are going to be needed. You know, technology comes in, it's going to have some impact, and that's appropriate. So you need to know what kinds of changes you're going to need to make. You need to know something about what those changes will, how they will impact your staff and what you're doing. And you need to know how much of that change you can manage and afford. It makes very little sense to get a great plan and then find out when you're halfway into it that you have 2/3 of the funding that will be necessary to make it work. Because you end up with a bridge 2/3 of the way across the river, and you know, you end up taking all that stuff the last third of the way in canoes, and that's not a very good way to go. And I'm sure many of you have seen that, and I've certainly seen it. One of the things that doing things in the way that we're describing here will allow you to do is to not overkill on technology and cost. To do things in the least expensive and least complex way, so that you might have a chance of actually getting budget to do the whole thing. Well, including non-technical people in a technical strategy sounds scary, and it can be challenging, but you have to know how your operations work and how technology and operations will impact them. Some technologists, not all, there are some technologists out there with a really good grasp of how to work with an operational environment, but some believe that operational people just can't do requirements analysis. I've heard that from people in large corporations and large government agencies. You know, those folks just don't understand. If we throw Agile or Six Sigma at them, they're not going to know what to do. But they're usually wrong. And in the right environment, though it's true, operating people are not going to be able to design or create technology. They are probably going to be able to do the kind of requirements analysis that's necessary as a precursor to going to the vendor community. Well, okay, now we've got, we know what we're doing. We've got our operational and our technical people involved. We have an understanding of the kinds of tools we're going to need at the functional level. So it's time now to go to the vendor community. I think we would probably, before this, take a look at what things might cost us overall and what kind of time we had, and go to our executive management to say, this is what we think we're going to be doing, and get their buy-in as well. Although, you know, they don't want to get involved for the most part in the details of what we're doing. What they want is something concise that they can make a decision on. So at the point just before we get to this point is probably a good time to do that. Well, I would suggest that whatever kind of organization you might be, issue a request for information. You're going to need to do a market survey to identify likely vendors. And remember, you now have a functional description of the major tools that you're going to need. So you know what parts of the market to go to, and a quick market survey, or you can buy it done if you feel not that you don't have anybody who can do it for you in-house. You can buy it done. It's going to tell you the kinds of vendors that you should be talking to. And don't feel like you only want to talk to one or two, because there are a lot of good vendors out there. A lot of them have specifics that you need, and a lot don't, but you still want to know that they're there. You want to issue a document that describes your needs in detail. I think the biggest one that I ever worked on, it was for a project that was just incredibly successful. It was $30 to $50 million range. It was almost 400 pages of requests for information, because it described every tool and every challenge and everything that it wanted vendors' tools to do. There were two reasons for that. I'll talk about that in a minute. Ask the vendors that you issue this RFI to for their best thoughts on how they can address your needs. You're not asking them to sell you something at this point. In fact, if you look at a federal request for information, it says very specifically right there, we're not planning to buy anything off this. So give us your thoughts, and we'll evaluate them, and we'll get back to you. I think that makes good sense across the board. Ask how well each vendor's tools, the ones that they might think are relevant to your environment, integrate with others, because one of the things that you are going to have to decide is, do you deal with one vendor who sells all of the tools you need and guarantees that they integrate? That might be a good thing, but you might end up buying a lot of things you don't need and getting some stuff that doesn't really do what you want, just in order to have a one-stop shop, which you prefer to do is to be able to buy pieces and have them integrate transparently. Standard data format, standard content, things like that makes really good sense. You want to ask for general pricing. You want to know in what ballpark these folks play, but you don't want a detailed quotation at this point. And from each of these vendors, you may never. And then discourage the standard sales package. I was a salesman for a while, not a very good one, but vendors really love to. They get a request for some information. They love to send out the standard sales package. You're going to get a lot of those unless you really discourage them. What you want is some thinking in that vendor's organization about how they can help you. Well, there is a difference, believe it or not, between an RFI and an RFP. Sometimes folks believe that's a distinction with no real difference, but that's not really true. When most vendors receive a formal request for proposal, their sales organization is penalized if they don't bid it. And I've been with big organizations who bid things that they never should have bid. They just didn't want to get yelled at for not bidding. I mean, one of the interesting things about that is that the request for information or proposal you don't bid, obviously you don't win, and then it becomes, in the vernacular within the organization, that's the one we could have won. And so you're in real trouble. So the tendency is prepare bid. If you have to ignore the requirements, and just go straight to the price list, bid something, and get it as close as you can. Don't worry, even if you don't win, you bid it. They often submit responses just to avoid the criticism. It would be great if that weren't the case. And there are some organizations that, for instance, don't pay their salesmen on commission or salary plus commission who take a different view. But that's not true for most. Now, the RFI, what happens when a vendor gets that? Usually, not always, but usually it gets to the technical parts of the vendor's organization. It gets sent over there to say, hey, could we do anything here? And interestingly enough, it often produces some really good thoughts out of that technical group on how they might help. In some cases, it produces thoughts that say, we just don't have anything that works here, because the technical people don't really care. They don't get penalized if the organization doesn't bid something. And an RFI comes in the door saying, this isn't a request for proposal. I'm not going to buy anything like this. So give me your thoughts and don't worry about the rest. More likely to generate a no bid. And one of the things that you want is you want the vendor community to self-qualify. You contact 20 or 40 or 45 vendors. You don't want to get something from every one of them and then have to wade through that. You want the ones who really can help you, and they probably will know who they are, to say, hey, we'd love to, but we don't think we can do it. You won't get that with an RFP, but you will with an RFI. So it's saved lots of time and money going through piles of unresponsive sales letters. Some of that stuff looks really great. And then they'll call and say, we want to do a demo, and it gets kind of crazy. When you've reviewed the responses, and you're not going to get as many responses as you sent out RFIs, you want to call the best back for in-depth sessions. You want to sit down with them and talk about what they responded with, what they think they can do for you, and give them a chance to explain themselves. Some will come in, especially if you've shown them some sample data in the RFI, they'll come in with a demo for your data. You ask for their technical folks when you call them. You say, we don't want the sales folks here, although feel free to have a salesman in the room. We want your technical and systems folks. And if a firm is honest, most are, they'll do that. They'll send a technical person who understands what they can do, understands what their limitations are, and can talk with you about this. From these presentations, you can do one of a few things. For instance, you may have to, for instance, if you're federal government, you may have to issue a formal request for a proposal, and it may have to be competitive. But at this point, you know how to structure that so that you're not going to go back to ground zero. You may, and we've seen this happen, know enough from these vendor sessions that you can negotiate directly with the best vendors and skip any kind of a request for proposal, because you get enough data. You say, give me a price because I think you're who I want to deal with. One of the things you want to do, and this is always a little difficult with vendors, is ask for a right of return if they don't meet your needs. Most software contracts have a clause down about page 37 that says, we warranty that this software will work as we have said. In other words, if they come in and show it working in a certain way, the lights are flashing in a certain way, and it does certain things, that it'll do that. And you can return it, and they'll have to pay you back if it doesn't do that. But there's also a clause that says, but we don't warranty this for application to any specific requirement, which means it'll work, but if it doesn't work for what you need, that's your problem, not ours. But if you put out an RFI and you've been very detailed about that, you can ask for a right of return, and then after they yell and scream and you yell and scream a little bit, you may get at least a partial right of return if what they are going to sell you doesn't meet your needs. It's worth doing it, if only to let them know that you're not going to go away easily if they really have sold you something that's not for what you really need. Well, if it's worth doing, and you move into implementation, now you're going to be in a position where you've identified vendors, you've selected tools, you're into the technology side. Now your technical people are really going to be a powerful asset. But you can use your functional analysis for things like scheduling. How long is it going to take? What kind of conversion requirements are we going to have, and how long will that take? What kind of in-process reviews should we do, and what are the milestones that we should have? You really need those from a functional point of view. At this point, you should have them. Use your preferred development strategy if you like Agile, if you like Six Sigma, or there are a whole bunch of them. By all means, use that. Let your technical folks do what they do well, but don't let that take completely over the project and ignore the functional side. In other words, it really is a tool of the overall project. It doesn't become the overall project. And unfortunately, the technology imperative will sometimes suggest that that's going to happen. Okay, thanks, folks. We'll take it from here. Don't let that happen. I think what will happen in the end, if you don't, is that both your operational and your technological people will be happier with the result. Keep your teams involved, because now you've got a testing resource. You can bring people in as new technology comes in, sit them down at a terminal and say, okay, do what you do, and you know what this should happen, how this should work, and let's see what happens. It's amazing at the suggestions for small customizations that operational people who really understand what they're doing and what they're testing can offer. In many cases, things that don't cost anything. It's just, well, if it worked this way, or if this happened ahead rather than behind, it would work better. And they can be an amazing resource. So by all means, use them. Keep them involved. It also keeps them happier because they don't feel like, they're being ushered out the door and technology has taken over. Now, there were kind of saw something a long time ago, and I haven't seen it not borne out, that operational people who are confronted with situations they don't like can kind of do one of two things, or more than one. They can kind of just collapse and their productivity really drops. They can leave, and of course in some cases you don't care, you'll replace them. But in other cases where you're talking about really complex or unique content, they may be irreplaceable, or certainly replaceable only at a very high cost. Or they may subvert the system. I've seen things where operational people put in the wrong code, did the wrong thing, and it turned out, although they never admitted it, that they did that purposely because they were really angry at what was being done to them and all the overtime they were putting in. So keep your teams involved. Keep them feeling that they have an interest in what you're doing. We live with incredible technological time. I mean, it's amazing. I wish I was going to live another 100 years because I can't imagine what things will be like. But technology alone won't save it. It's a hard thing to accept sometimes because technology is so powerful, but it won't. There have been success and failure stories at every stage, from punch card forward. I was in the computer room of my first job with the telephone company on the West Coast. I looked in an old desk in the computer room. By the way, those were 1401 card computers and sorters and collators and things like that. And I saw a 1932 book from IBM that said, here's how you do a accounts payable system with one key punch and a card gauge. You know what a card gauge is? The little metal stick that you stick through the holes in the card, to stack the cards to see how many have the same punch. Here was a whole system that could be built with, you could even call it technology, and in some cases, it probably worked. So success and failure is nothing new. Technology has not really changed that a lot, and so we kind of need to go at things from that point of view. The difference then is in how well the technology is planned, and that's what we're talking about here today. We can ignore this reality, and many organizations do, at least once or twice, or we can use it to reap the rewards that the technological world offers. I think it's really our choice, but it's a choice that you have to make up front. You can't do it at the end. So at any rate, that kind of does me. I hope this has been valuable, and certainly would like to answer any questions that you may have.
Hi, Barry. This is Jennifer again. Thank you so much. We have a few questions that have come in. I want to remind everyone on the call that you may ask questions in the questions bar on the panel that should be on your computer. So let's get started with a few things that we have so far. The first one is, I'm concerned about implementation delays. How can we manage that?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is to define what's a delay. In other words, in any project, there is kind of an imperative, and we don't always know it going in, as to how long this is going to take if we do it right. It's very important in the early stages to look very closely at, especially the impact on the organization, because, you know, technology can move very rapidly. You can install technology, get it customized, get it up and running in, you know, a few weeks or a couple of months. But if you're talking about changes to how your organization works, which is impact on staff, on training, on skills, that is going to take longer because people don't react as fast. And so I would suggest that you look at that, look at the impact on your human parts, your procedural parts. Say, how long is that going to take us? In many cases, for instance, if you work in an industry or part of government that works on cycles, a yearly cycle, a quarterly cycle, it may take several cycles to do one. You may not be able to do things in one shot, and that will delay you, obviously, because you may be able to do some of it, and then you have to wait till the next cycle to do the rest. But if you look at all of those things up front, I think you'll have a fair idea of how long a successful implementation is going to take you. One of the things that I would certainly suggest that you avoid is allowing anyone, technical people, the operational people, or executive management, to give you an arbitrary number and say you must do this by X date. They may be right, but in about 90% of the cases, that's going to be somewhat short of what it'll take to actually do it. And if you get into a position where you're facing that, and that gets set in stone, then what you'll end up doing is missing that date and have to come up with another date. You maybe miss that date, and every time you miss a date, you lose productivity in the project. So it's very important to work with all of the people who might want to set a date, to work with, if you have dates that have to be met, like, if you're working in a yearly cycle, it might take you 2 years to do it. Hopefully not, but if that's the case, better to know it going in than to face it when you get down to a critical point in the project and realize you're not going to make whatever date you give. I hope that helps. There really is no good, no one way to look at this, but I think looking at your organization and the impact on it is probably going to give you the best idea of how long it'll take to do the project successfully.
Great, thank you so much. We have another question that's come in, and I just want to remind people again, you can ask questions in the question bar, and I will relay them to Barry. There's no need to raise hands. I know that's a function that's on here, but I'm not using it currently, although I will check. Let's see. I have to do a formal procurement. I'm not sure if I can use an RFI. What do you recommend? And that's interesting because you did speak to understanding the difference between an RFI and an RFP.
Sure. Well, of course, the first question is, can you use one? Can you use an RFI? I know if you're in the federal government, you can. There are some places where you may not be able to. Some states, I think, don't support an RFI, and I must tell you, I'm not 100% sure, which states are which. But if you can't use an RFI and you have to go to a formal procurement, I think what you end up doing then is bringing the concepts that you would have used in the RFI to the extent you can into the formal procurement. Ask all those same questions. Provide more detail. I once worked with a state government that put out a major procurement, and they did 8 pages of requirements description. I mean, it was, I'm sure people were laughing all over the industry because they simply hadn't described it well enough. So describe it very well. Let the people know that you want their best thoughts. Now, you may not get them in an RFP, but at least give it a try. So you can, to some extent, merge the concept. And I would think that would probably be your best bet.
Okay. Let's see. We have one more here that's come in, and I'm going to just give one more reminder. We're still taking questions right now. Our company, and this is interesting because this is something I'm on a learning curve about personally. Our company typically uses Six Sigma procedures. Can this, I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, can this relate? How can this relate?
Well, I think it does, and I think one of the things we have to remember about Six Sigma, and it, even, I'm not sure even that Jack Welch gets it right. Six Sigma was designed and named for repetitive manufacturing processes. The whole idea was that you looked to reduce defects to a certain level, within a certain number of standard deviations from the mean, and works very well. It has been kind of expanded to information technology and to information projects, and the basic underlying precepts of Six Sigma, which is open communication, functional analysis, things like that, are all very relevant. But when you get up into the details of Six Sigma, it gets tougher and tougher to apply those rules that are really based on repetitive processes to processes, for instance, like an automation process where the project itself is not going to be repeated. What you would typically have better luck with is if you're doing something repetitive with the technology that the process brings in, you could probably very nicely apply the full Six Sigma range. But I would think that it would relate to simply to say, look at the foundation of Six Sigma, which is pretty standard stuff, the kinds of things we've been talking about. You could even change some of the terminology so that you use some of those, open communication and concurrent kinds of things, and team building and things of that sort in your project from the start, and that way it flows right into Six Sigma. But I think until you get to the point of actually doing technology, I'm not sure Six Sigma is, at least the details of the process, is going to help you. There are probably people throwing shoes at the screen right now because what I just said is perhaps not accepted over the entire industry, but that certainly has been my experience. So I think you can relate, but you want to stick with the basic underlying concepts that Six Sigma is built on.
Okay. Barry, I believe those are all the questions we have. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and Barry, thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. Just to remind everyone, we will make this webinar available for replay within the next day or so, and if you have any further questions, you can reach out to Barry or to DCL, and please feel free to get in touch. Thank you so much, and everyone have a wonderful day. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you all.